Welcome back to Origins Unveiled. In this second episode, we journey through time with Friedrich Engels as he maps humanity's ascent from primitive life to organized society based on the groundbreaking framework of Lewis Henry Morgan.
That's right. We're really digging into Engels' classic work, Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And he draws so heavily on Lewis Henry Morgan.
Morgan's work was pretty revolutionary for its time, wasn't it? Trying to bring some order to, well, prehistory.
Absolutely. First one to really attempt a systematic classification of those earliest periods of human development.
And the key principle, the sort of engine driving this whole classification, it was all about food, right? How people actually got their sustenance.
Exactly that. How humans produced or, acquired their food. That was the foundation for Morgan. He laid out these three huge epochs: savagery, barbarism, and then leading into civilization.
And family structures evolved too, but Engels notes they didn't track quite as neatly.
Yeah, they developed in parallel, but the markers weren't always as distinct, not like the really tangible shifts in getting food.
Okay, so let's get into this framework. We're essentially walking through these ancient stages, looking at the inventions, the ways of life, how each step happened.
Right, so Morgan's big three: savagery, barbarism, civilization. That's the main structure. But then he subdivides the first two.
Lower, middle, and upper stages for both savagery and barbarism.
Correct, to get more detail. And always, the driving force is progress made in the production of food.
It makes sense. Morgan's, quote, hammers it home, doesn't it? Something like, upon their skill in this direction, the whole question of human supremacy depended.
Yeah, and that great epochs have been identified with the enlargement of the sources of subsistence. It wasn't just one factor among many. For Morgan, this was it.
It's fascinating because these aren't just small tweaks. These advances in getting food, they changed everything. Daily life, society itself.
Completely reshaped it, paved the way for totally new social structures.
All right, let's start at the beginning then. What does this lower stage of savagery even look like according to Morgan and Engels?
Well, this is almost reaching back before history, based on our evolution. Picture humanity's infancy, maybe in tropical or subtropical forests.
And humans weren't exactly top of the food chain yet.
No, the source suggests partially tree-dwelling, for safety,
Right.
against bigger predators.
And food, just grabbing whatever's there.
Purely. Fruits, nuts, roots, just foraging.
Mm.
The absolutely key development linked to the stage, separating us from animal ancestors, was articulate speech.
But we don't have any actual examples of people living exactly like this when, say, Europeans started exploring.
Right, Engels makes that point. No known historical peoples were found at this baseline level. It's more of a necessary starting point, a reconstruction based on evolution.
Okay, so that's the foundation. What pushes humanity into the middle stage of savagery? What changes?
The big shift is tapping into a new major food source: fish, another aquatic life.
Ah, but you can't just munch on raw fish easily. That needs technology.
Exactly. Fire. The use of fire is the hallmark of this middle stage. It makes fish edible, digestible, and suddenly humans aren't tied just to specific land areas.
How so?
Well, with fish as a food source, they could follow rivers, spread along coastlines. It allowed for migration, expansion across the earth, independent of local foraging conditions to some extent.
And we see archaeological traces of this period.
Yes, the source connects this with those very early, crudely made flint tools, the paleoliths, unsharpened, basic stone tools found pretty much everywhere from this era.
And fire wasn't just for cooking fish.
No, they also figured out making fire by friction. That let them cook other things like starchy roots, making them more nutritious. And the first weapons start appearing: basic clubs, spears. So some hunting starts, but fish and foraging are still key.
But food wasn't always guaranteed, which led to less savory practices.
Yes. Cannibalism is thought to have arisen in the stage, likely due to that uncertainty of food supply. And it apparently lingered. The source mentions Australian Aborigines and many Polynesians as examples of groups considered to be in this middle stage when first documented.
Okay, moving up the ladder within savagery, what defines the upper stage? What's the breakthrough?
This is a big one. The invention of the bow and arrow. Engels calls it the decisive invention for this whole epoch of savagery.
Why decisive? How is it so much better than a spear?
Because it transforms hunting. Game becomes a regular, reliable food source, not just an occasional lucky break. Hunting becomes a normal part of work, of subsistence.
And the bow itself is quite sophisticated.
It is. It's a complex tool. Making and using one effectively implies, well, accumulated knowledge, experience, more advanced thinking.
So this signals a jump in how people lived, not just how they hunted.
Definitely. Groups that had the bow and arrow but hadn't yet developed pottery, that's the next big dividing line. They show signs of more complex living, the beginnings of village settlements, more control over getting food.
What kind of other technologies appear here?
Things like wooden vessels, finger weaving, making baskets, and significantly sharpened stone tools, the neoliths, new stone tools. Even starting to build dugout canoes using fire and axes, and sometimes houses using beams and planks, a real step up.
Any specific groups cited as examples?
The source points to some Indian tribes in Northwest America. They had the bow and arrow, were skilled hunters and fishers, but hadn't adopted pottery yet. Engels draws a powerful parallel here. The bow and arrow was to savagery what the iron sword was for barbarism, and firearms for civilization. Really highlights its importance.
That's a great comparison. Okay, so the bow and arrow marks the peak of savagery. What comes next? This brings us to barbarism. What kicks off the lower stage here?
Pottery. The introduction of pottery is the key marker.
How might that have even started?
The idea Engels presents, following Morgan, is that maybe people started coating woven baskets or wooden containers with clay, to make them fireproof for cooking.
Ah, and then realized the baked clay held its shape.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Eventually discovering the clay pot itself worked maybe even better.
And this stage, barbarism, is also where human development starts to look really different depending on where you were in the world.
Yes, this is where the paths diverge significantly, based entirely on the natural endowments of the Eastern Hemisphere, the Old World, versus the Western Hemisphere, the Americas.
Because barbarism isn't just about pottery. It's about actually producing food.
That's the defining feature of barbarism overall, the shift towards domesticating animals, breeding them, and cultivating plants. Actively creating food sources, not just finding them.
And the Old World and New World had very different toolkits for this.
Massively different. The Old World had nearly all the easily domesticable animals, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, and most key cereals like wheat and barley. The Americas really only had the llama, and only in the Andes region, plus maize, which was a fantastic cereal, but essentially just the one main grain.
So these differences set development off on fundamentally different tracks.
Absolutely. Let's follow the American path first into the middle stage of barbarism there.
Okay, what characterized progress in the Western Hemisphere?
Primarily, it was advancements in cultivating plants, often involving irrigation systems, and architecture using sun-dried adobe bricks or stone.
So settled agriculture was key.
Very much so. You had groups Engels classifies as lower barbarians, like tribes east of the Mississippi who were already practicing horticulture, growing maize, gourds, melons, living in wooden houses, often in villages protected by palisades like wooden fences.
And this contrasted with other groups.
Yeah, you still had groups further west, maybe near the Columbia River, who were still technically in upper savagery. They didn't have pottery or plant cultivation yet.
But the more famous societies, the ones the Spanish encountered.
Right, the Pueblo Indians in the Southwest, or the Aztecs in Mexico, Maya in Central America, Incas in Peru, they were considered to be in this middle stage of barbarism.
What defined their societies?
Impressive adobe or stone buildings, often fortress-like. Their main food came from intensively cultivated plants, especially maize, supported by irrigation. They had domesticated some animals, turkeys, other birds by the Mexicans, the llama, crucially, by the Peruvians.
What about metals?
They worked metals like gold, silver, copper, but not iron. That's a key distinction. Their tools and weapons were still primarily stone, or these softer metals. Their whole line of development, as Engels notes, was cut short by the European conquest.
A really distinct path then, tragically interrupted. Okay, let's switch hemispheres. Middle stage of barbarism in the Old World. What's the story there?
It seems to have started differently, primarily with the domestication of milk and meat-producing animals, raising herds. Plant cultivation, horticulture appears to become significant a bit later in this sequence.
And this focus on herding animals had major social consequences.
A huge impact. It's linked to the differentiation of major language and cultural groups, like the Aryans and Semites.
How does the language link work?
Well, the observation is that many related Aryan languages across Europe and Asia share common root words for cattle and other herd animals, suggesting herding was ancient and central. But their words for cultivated plants often differ, suggesting agriculture might have developed more separately within those groups later on.
So this led to a pastoral, nomadic, or semi-nomadic lifestyle.
For many, yes. Keeping large herds often meant following the grass. Think of the Semitic peoples on the grassy river plains of Mesopotamia, or the Aryans spreading across the steppes of Central Asia and into India and Eastern Europe. Domestication itself probably started near the edges of these great grasslands.
How did farming eventually fit in then?
As these pastoral groups may be pushed into more forested areas or faced seasons where grazing wasn't enough, they needed grain. The interesting idea raised is that maybe grain cultivation started primarily to produce fodder, winter feed for their animals.
Plants for the animals before plants for the people.
Possibly. It suggests that large-scale grain farming for human consumption might have developed out of the needs of animal husbandry in this part of the world.
Then what was the supposed impact of this diet, rich in milk and meat?
The source speculates this abundant animal protein, especially for child development, might partly explain the perceived superior development of the Aryan and Semitic peoples. It even makes a comparison regarding brain development relative to the more plant-reliant Pueblo Indians based on the anthropological data available then.
Okay. And cannibalism.
It largely fades out during this stage, according to the text, surviving mostly just as a ritual or magical practice, not for subsistence.
Right. So that takes us to the final step before civilization, the upper stage of barbarism. What's the defining technology here?
Iron, smelting iron ore. That's the game changer.
And this is the immediate lead up to what we call civilization.
Yes. Within this framework, the invention of alphabetic writing and its use for literary records marks the transition into civilization proper. That's dated roughly around 3000 BCE in Mesopotamia. And crucially, Engels stresses only the Eastern Hemisphere independently completed this full upper stage of barbarism and transitioned from it.
And the pace of change picked up dramatically.
Hugely. The claim is that this single stage saw more progress in production methods than all the preceding stages combined.
Wow. What are the classic examples of societies at this stage?
Think of the Greeks of the heroic age, the world of Homer's Iliad, or the Italian tribes just before Rome unified them. The Germanic tribes described by Tacitus, the Norsemen of the Viking Age, these are all placed within this upper stage.
And what specific innovation, enabled by iron, had the biggest impact?
It has to be the iron plowshare, especially when drawn by cattle.
Why was that so revolutionary?
It allowed for large-scale agriculture, field cultivation, not just small garden plots. This meant, for the first time really, a potentially limitless food supply relative to earlier methods.
And that changed the landscape, literally.
Yes. You could now clear forests effectively using iron axes and spades, turn woodland into farmland on a massive scale, and the consequence of all that food.
More people, denser population.
Exactly. A rapid increase in population became possible. People could live closer together in larger settlements. The source suggests large states or organizations, like over 500,000 people, were pretty much impossible before the kind of food surplus generated by Iron Age agriculture.
So if we look at Homeric Greece as a sort of peak example of this stage, what achievements do we see?
A whole suite of advanced technologies. Fully developed iron tools for all sorts of crafts. Bellows for hotter fires, the hand mill for grinding grain, the potter's wheel for mass production of ceramics, oil and winemaking, metalworking that was becoming almost an art form.
And bigger structures, too.
Yes, wagons, war chariots. Shipbuilding, using beams and planks, not just dugout canoes. The beginnings of architecture as a distinct art. Fortified towns and cities with walls. And of course, complex culture, epic poetry, mythology.
Sounds incredibly advanced.
It really was. And the source notes that if you compare Homer's Greeks with, say, the Germans described by Tacitus centuries later, you see the sheer range and richness of development possible within the single upper stage of barbarism.
Okay, let's quickly recap Morgan's framework as Engels uses it. Savagery is basically
taking what nature offers. Appropriating natural products. Tools are mainly aids for that.
Barbarism is the shift to
actively producing, breeding animals, cultivating plants, using human activity to increase nature's yield.
And civilization then builds on that with
more advanced ways of working natural materials, industry, art, applying labor to nature in more complex ways. And these stages, grounded in production and how people make a living, they're presented as pretty solid. Hard to argue with the broad strokes.
So this journey through savagery and barbarism, it really sets the stage for understanding what comes next, doesn't it? The emergence of civilization itself.
Exactly. This sketch gives us the foundation. But the really dramatic changes, the big contrasts that shape the modern world private property, the state, those emerge in the transition out of barbarism and into civilization, which is a whole other story.
It's really something to think about, isn't it? How deeply our entire social structure, our progress as a species, maybe even our physical makeup, seems tied to the very basic ways we figured out how to feed ourselves. From mastering fire to cook fish, all the way to the iron plow reshaping continents. It seems like every major leap in controlling our subsistence has fundamentally rewired everything else about human life.